slides. And whenever you're ready, if you can press got it over there. Thank you. And start.
All right. Good morning. Hope everybody's week's going well. Once again, we're the shortwave infrared neuromodulation gadget, otherwise known as swing. Our team name is the infrared effect, otherwise known as tire. So we are tire swing. And so we're still the same team. A little bit of changes here. I've moved a little bit to help out with software, and we unfortunately did lose a team member, but we can talk about that a little bit later. So jump into the problem statement.
Yeah, so we decided to change this up a little bit from last time. Before we mainly focused on the problem being the invasive techniques themselves being risky, but I guess we're more focusing now on what the problem actually is, you can say, like mental disorders, such as like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, that affect deep regions of the brain, these portions of the brain that can be treated with deep brain stimulation. We're going to focus on that as being the main problem. And still the problem still persists that, you know, one technique for these is deep brain stimulation. It is a very risky procedure. As Dr. Loraco said before, it's like a highway for infection or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, so our sponsors and stakeholders stayed the same. Besides, we also added the FDA as well, because we want to stay in FDA regulation if we eventually in later capsules want to get into human testing and stuff like that. Also, inpatients and outpatients in the move to the top, because those are most direct stakeholders and are, in our opinion, are most important, because those are the ones with the mental disorders that we want to fix. Yeah, so our needs and constraints stayed the same for the most part, besides wearable. We talked with Dr. Krishna about getting rid of wearable, and he agreed that more importantly, we want to do a proof of concept and focus more on just getting the concept proven instead of actually designing a wearable object. Wearable is still a potential stretch goal, but it's not at the forefront of our design moving forward. And then looking at requirements for power, changed from 1 to 5 milliwatts to 1 to 500. We got a 100 milliwatt laser, and that's about class 3B laser. So 1 to 500 range is class 3B. So that's why I looked at that range as well. We talked to Dr. Rodigan and Dr. Krishna about this as well, and they both agreed that that was a good range.
So jumping into our experimental setup, we have our setup. Visually, it looks the exact same as the PDR. There have been a couple changes between all three of the main areas, but the three main areas would be the laser setup, including the photodetector, the optical phantom, and then also the simulation and software. And so we have kind of this loop here where our laser setup is providing our parameters for, you know, things like power or pulse width or anything like that to our simulation and software. And then with that information, we can validate what we're receiving from the photodetector experimentally. So if we're receiving a certain power output, we can validate that with our power input. And then using software, we're we're approximating the optical coefficients that we do not have for 1550 nanometer. And so first we'll jump right into the laser setup and photodetector portion. So the only real change here is we went from a TO CAN laser to a 1550 nanometer fiber coupled laser source. So essentially it went from a little round 5.6 millimeter cylinder to a little chip. In terms of the overall diagram, it doesn't change anything, but it did change things on the component level. So we need a lot more mounting and a lot more mating sleeves and things like that for fiber coupling. So this is really the only big change from the laser setup side. Like Matt mentioned as well, this is a 100 milliwatt laser over a 5 milliwatt laser before. So this gives us a larger range to test at as well.
Yeah, so going into the optical phantom, right now we still have paraffin wax as our main material. Just to go over it again, the refractive index was 1.442 to 1.448. Its melting point is about 56 degrees Celsius. We got pure paraffin wax, so it's 100% hydrocarbon wax. It comes in, if you look to the right, there's a picture of it from Carolina Labs. It's lab grade, so it's pure. It comes in 1 pound shipment, so it's a 5 by 3 by 2 inches. And we decided to get 5 of those to start. We felt that would be enough at least to get through the testing and prototyping phase before we get to our final product phase. And then looking at our scattering agent, we're sticking with titanium dioxide. So titanium dioxide is a commonly used scattering pigment. The reason for this, it does have a high refractive index, which makes it better at bending light, and it's used in common things like sunscreen. And then for absorption agent, we just went with a common black dye. A lot of studies we looked at didn't use one specific dye, one specific element. There wasn't a titanium dioxide of absorption agents. So first we wanted to see what material, and there was powders and liquid, and there was no real consistency between either of which one was more important or which was more frequently used. So we decided to go with just a black powder dye to match this titanium dioxide as well. And then we figured out our build process for our optical phantom molds. So first, we're going to measure out the paraffin wax to make sure we have the correct amount. And then that'll go on a hot plate in a beaker. And as that's melting, we're going to measure out the absorption and scattering dyes. And as it's completely melted, we'll pour the dyes into the beaker. And then while the beaker is still on the hot plate, so it's still hot, we're going to use an overhead stirrer to mix it. And once it's a homogeneous solution, we're going to pour it into 3D printed molds that we designed ourselves.
Right, so the next aspect of our design here is definitely gonna be the simulation and the software. And so I guess there are two main stages. One would be the pre-processing stage, like that same as before. And then the next stage, we're actually decided going with something called MCX, Monte-Carlo Extreme. And that's just a tool in MATLAB that you can use to visualize how photon density like disperses throughout your media. And in our case, our media would be the head. And then in the pre-processing stage, we basically took our data that we have gotten, just from Dr. Ronigan and his textbook, and we tried to interpolate and extrapolate data for our absorption and scattering coefficients for that 1550 nanometer wavelength.
So with the data that Dr. Ronigan gave us from the textbook cited at the bottom, this is the initial data that we were given. The main thing to see here is that the scalp and skull wavelengths are from 800 to 2000 nanometer. So that is perfectly fine for a 1550 nanometer wavelength. But the white matter, gray matter, so the brain matter here only goes up to 1300 nanometer. So kind of the problem here would be extrapolating that data out to 1550. And so I'm going to kind of walk through my estimation of those coefficients. And so the first thing I do is apply a cubic interpolation to each of these lines to give us a continuous function. And as Dr. LaRocco said, this is one way we can fit this complexity, but not overfit this model as well. And then after that, I go through and I analyze that overlap range from 800 to 1300 nanometers. So here I'm showing the gray matter line. And what I'm doing is over that range, I calculate the average vertical offset between the gray matter and the scalp, and then the gray matter and the skull as well. And so that gives us two variables that we can then add on and give two more lines. So I've got these grouped by color. The darkest green would be our approximation based on the scalp vertical offset, and then the slightly lighter green at the top would be the skull approximation, and then the lightest green would be the average between those two. So that gives us kind of three avenues to explore in terms of estimating that gray matter coefficient. And then now I'm showing the purple group is the white matter approximation as well. And so zooming in, I have some data points just showing our scalp, skull, and then the three lines that lay above our skull as well. This gives us a couple different avenues to explore in terms of different coefficients that we can test at, as well as the scalp and skull that we know, at least we have interpolated between data points. The reason I'm showing only the three above the skull is because we anticipate, based on the previous trend, that the brain matter would be higher than the skull, not lower. But we do have data at the lower portions if we wanted to test at those. Let's say that the worst case doesn't end up working out, then we can at least say, well, if the absorption coefficient were a little bit lower, then it would work. So something along those lines would be at least something we can mess around with experimentally.
Yeah, and then so the next step of after the software stage is to set up the simulation environment. And so basically using MCX, there was this model that it's cited there. But this model basically is a model of derived from a bunch of MRI images in general. And so it's a rough model of how you can create a mesh of the brain to simulate. And so the main layers there are gonna be the scalp, the bone, CSF, which stands for cerebral spinal fluid, gray matter and white matter. And ideally what this mesh generation software does is it creates meshes of each individual portion, and then it combines them and creates a cross-sectional area that you can then visualize. And so this is an example of how the visualization would look. So on the left there is using the coefficients for 1064 nanometers, near the scattering, absorption, and just everything for 1064 nanometers at that cochlear implanted range, which is that part of the ear right there that we're trying to do the simulation. And then on the right is going to be the absorption coefficients for 1550 nanometers. But for consistency, we use all the same coefficients of 1064 just to show the difference. And as you can see, there's definitely more absorption at 1550 nanometers since it doesn't disperse as far throughout. And there's a lot more red. And so the lighter colors means there's more intensity at that spot. And so there's a lot more red in the areas that it does absorb than in the 1064. And so this basically concludes our experimental setup here. Just to recap, as Cam said before, we have our physical setup, our optical phantom, and our simulation and software portions.
And so next we wanted to jump into project management. And so we have our milestone tables from this previous semester, our course milestones. As you can see, we're meeting some of those milestones today by giving this presentation. Aside from that, we have our project milestones. So really all I wanted to highlight here is a couple of these dates are in red, just indicating that we did fall behind in some areas, but it didn't set us back significantly. Just wanted to highlight that this project is not perfect. We're not all imperfect. So jumping into our component as well, this is our cost estimate for the laser setup. So we are requesting 5,800 and some change. But the good news is there's a 2% discount when you buy over $5,000 at the same time. So that actually jumps down to about 5,670. But this would be our cost estimate for the laser setup. Again, pointing out that fiber coupled laser instead of the TO CAN laser.
Yeah, so getting to our cost estimate for the optical phantom setup. Right now, if you look, you see the 3D printing has that little asterisk right next to it. That's because that's our estimated cost for it. We haven't really paid anything for 3D printing yet. But right now, I think everything besides the Walmart stuff has been ordered, which is the black powder dye, if I remember correctly.
Everything is here except that one.
Except that one, yes. And so that leaves our total right at around 430, which gives us a little bit more wiggle room if we need to buy more wax, more powder, stuff like that.
Yep, and then we have our spring 2023 first 5 weeks planned out. Admittedly, it's an optimistic timeline. However, our kind of mentality is if we can get all of these things done in the first 5 weeks, it opens up a lot of time that we can spend experimenting or exploring other avenues or building different molds or things along those lines. And if we don't, then we still have a lot of semester left to either pivot or adjust the project how we see fit. And so part of that is we identify a critical path. So the first one would be using my approximation method, just validating that, making sure, how do we know this is a reliable method? How can we trust these coefficients? That would be our first path in the critical, or first point in the critical path. Once we know that, then we can start building our sample molds with those coefficients. And then once we have all those sample molds built, we can build our multi-sample optical phantom. And then once we have the whole phantom built, we can use the simulation to verify that information that we received from the experimental testing. And so jumping into goals for next semester, my goals will be to finish the optical coefficient approximation verification, to build the laser setup, and then also help test out those sample molds and develop a testing method for the sample molds using the laser setup, whether that be with an integrating sphere or just using multiple different samples. Essentially, how do we know that the samples that we're building have the optical coefficients that we've approximated?
Yeah, and mainly goals for me, is to find a way to show the photon distribution on a 3D model instead of a 2D space. So right now we have that 2D graph. I want to see if I can make it into a 3D model, just so we can visualize it more clearly. And then the next next goal that I have, it's partially on the works here, but it's basically simulating the neural network so that whenever we have these areas where the intensity is high, how would it actually affect the neuronal activity in that region? And then lastly, do some more experimentation and incorporate maybe open filters for the optical simulations, because right now we're using like a MCX, and so maybe open filters can provide more settings that we can mess around with.
Yeah, and then for me, my main goal is finding accurate mixtures for each layer. So going through that build process we talked about earlier, just over and over again and testing with CAM to get the right mixture for each layer of the optical phantom brain. And then the next one is creating more detailed molds. So right now ours is through SolidWorks, and we've have kind of base molds where we're going to keep trying to make it look more and more realistic. And by that, it means more physically realistic. We would still have, even if it is just a block of paraffin wax at the end, it would still have the same optical properties as our gold brain. It just would look more like a brain instead of just a block of paraffin wax.
And so we also wanted to talk about what we've learned this semester. So speaking for myself, certainly learned a lot about project management. I've never managed a project quite this complicated. Certainly not a project that will be a whole year long. I've had a couple group projects that are a semester long, but like I said, not this complicated. In terms of the light or laser setup, I've never worked with highly scattering mediums. So I've tested laser diodes before, but never worked with how light interacts with biological tissue or really matter at all. So certainly learned a lot about applying my previous course knowledge to this project. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning of the project or the presentation, we did lose a team member, so we're not the same group standing up here. So I wanted to take a moment and reflect on that as well. Learned about accountability, kind of asking myself the question of, can I check in more? Can I step in earlier? Things like that, just to prevent those kind of team transitions and help out where I can more.
Yeah, and then for me on the technical side, if you asked me at the beginning of the semester about scattering, absorption, refractive index, I'd cover my ears, hide under a table, get scared. So I got to learn a lot about the brain, a lot about optical properties of the brain, anatomy of the brain, which was very interesting to me. And then for the group side, working on a unique and novel approach for something that is not a heavily researched topic was very new to me, very fun to me, and I definitely honed in my research skills. And then just in a group setting, honesty. So being honest about what I can bring to the table, what others can bring to the table and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then for me, kind of like what Cam said, like just kind of jumping off that a little bit, it's like definitely taking ownership of tasks and like the importance of like each group member having ownership of their own task. And then also just similar to Matt again, like I've worked on like modeling of the brain before, you know, just theoretically with like other professors and across other departments, but I've never once touched anything like this or done anything like this. So and I knew zero about just optics in general before coming in. Like the most I knew was Snell's law, so definitely it's a little step up from that. So yeah, I learned a lot about that, and then just about ownership in general and what it means to take ownership.
And so to conclude again, we'll show you what we don't want to happen. So we'll go ahead and open it up for questions or feedback and any comments as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll open the floor to Dr. Bennington. So yes.
Sure, thank you. So I'm very impressed that you've chosen such a multidisciplinary project. And I'll start with that, because this is really very challenging to come out of electrical engineering background alone and take on a project this complex that's really pulling in a lot of pieces. So I'm really impressed with that. I'd actually like you to jump basically clear back to the beginning. Your problem statement made a lot of sense to me. I would like you to clarify the connection between your problem statement and the particular, you know, task you have chosen to take on of creating this optical phantom.
Okay. So part of our problem statement is the kind of the diseases that affect the brain, being Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia, things of that ilk. Our kind of goal, or the goal of this project, would be to provide a proof of concept that using a laser, we can provide a non-invasive method, or at least a area of exploration to look into stimulating those areas of either no neuron activity or less neuron activity, noisy neuron activity, anything along those lines. Can we provide enough energy to stimulate those areas and potentially lead to a improved health? Certainly, I don't expect this to be a cure by any means, but certainly helping out delay any certain symptoms of those diseases as well.
Or like stabilization, things like that. Whenever somebody with Alzheimer's has a tremor, like maybe using stimulation to stabilize certain areas, things like that. It's just provide, yeah.
Can you go to the knees real quickly? I just want to build on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our most important need that Dr. Krishna emphasized over and over again was non-invasive. So that's why we went through the laser route. And then he also told us 1550 nanometers. That's kind of how we got started there. And from there on, we worked on through user-friendly, realistic safety, performance, and whatnot.
No, I mean, that's very helpful. And I think, you know, if you think about giving these presentations in the future, I would include that connection, because that lets me build to the question I really want, which is, now that you're thinking about these experiments that you want to do, a lot of it is about verifying, you know, that the phantom you built is realistic enough, matches your simulations. Are there measurements you're going to be doing that really get back to the way you just framed that problem about being able to be non-invasive, to get enough optical power to the right regions? What do you view as kind of the closing measurements that you will make to connect what you've done back to this larger problem?
Yeah, so essentially in the beginning of this semester, we spent, I want to say 3 weeks just researching. So this was not very hands-on in the beginning. We spent a lot of time just researching and learning about this field. As you said, it's multidisciplinary. I came in not knowing anything about the brain, so I had to learn a lot. So our initial testing plan, and of course this could change, is to look at what is our power output at certain regions of the brain. So if we build this optical phantom, then we can look at the dimensions of the brain. Let's say we want to target the basal ganglia. Then we could look at putting our photodetector where the X, Y, and Z coordinates would be of the basal ganglia and see what is our optical power output at that point. And can we convert that to some sort of energy or voltage that would apply to the neurons in that area where it's being absorbed, and say, okay, we're reading a 60 millivolt activation energy of neurons. And so is that enough to stimulate this area and incite an action potential for the neurons to activate, essentially?
Yeah, so essentially, like if I would add on, basically we take our output from the photodetector and then try to run it through an equivalent circuit model of that region of the brain and see if that could potentially be enough to activate the neurons.
Good. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I'll just leave a suggestion that, you know, as you think about these next stages that you're going to do next semester, to really kind of define for yourself, like, how far are you trying to reach? What is going to be the marker of success? You know, is it going to be sufficient for success to be that you've reproduced the optical coefficients and that you can mold the wax? Or are you really trying to reach this stage of some sort of measurement of, you know, optical penetration compared back against the model, and kind of define what your target really is, how far you want to go? Because this is a project that could go on a long time, and there are lots of additional steps you could take. And so I think it's important for you as a team to understand what you're really aiming for.
I guess I have one question for you, if you don't mind. What would you recommend? Like, what kind of equivalent circuit model would you recommend if we were to go that route?
I mean, so I think what you've proposed is already a good, I mean, I like your neural network and thinking about, you know, the energy consequences on neurons. I think that makes a connection to something very tangible that you can also then measure in the lab, which is important to do, is to make sure that, you know, the simulations that you're doing have some connection back to some physical thing that you can measure in the lab. You'll be able to measure the energy reaching certain positions, and then make the case of whether that, you know, given how much energy you're actually getting, what do you believe you can do with that? What's really feasible in terms of these treatment models? And I think the neural network modeling you're thinking about allows for that.
Okay.
All right. A couple of them. One, to build on some of what TJ was talking about. What about not just energy accumulation, but thermal accumulation in the brain, because this is some of the most important tissue in the body, and injury either in the ear canal or in the brain is going to be an issue. With the 1550 compared to the 1064, we saw a lot of that was focused right around the cochlear area, right? So do you believe, based on your simulations, that there is a chance of thermal accumulation that might cause adverse effects from prolonged use in this case compared to just the 1064?
Yeah, so certainly any absorbed photon will disperse its energy through a thermal means. So that'll be something that we look into using something along the lines of thermistors. We can place those throughout our mold. What I really like about the way we're building our molds is it starts off as a liquid. So if we wanted to measure somewhere along the lines of in the middle of the brain, then while it's a liquid, we could place some measuring device, let's say a thermistor, in that portion of the brain and just see, okay, before the stimulation occurred, it was at 22 degrees Celsius. After we pulsed it for, let's say, 500 nanoseconds or something along those lines, then it increased to 24 degrees Celsius. Is that something that we need to take into account? Do we need to measure anywhere else in the brain, things along those lines? So that'll be something that we can incorporate into our experimental setup.
So if you want to fry someone's brain, go to that.
Well, on a related note, because implantable hearing aid devices have been one of the topics we've touched on before, is there anything in terms of power, dosage, or pulse settings that you would vary from that? Because we both have technological parallels in some ways, but differences. So what pulse parameters or what stimulation parameters would you recommend with this device compared to, say, the infrared device or even our earlier photobiomodulation work?
Yeah, so certainly looking at an electric pulse, albeit an invasive procedure, we can use that as kind of like a baseline. So the pulse width that they're using in the study that you're referencing is 100 microseconds. So that would be kind of one baseline that we look at. Can we achieve this goal at 100 microseconds, or do we need to go longer because we're not invasive, we're not sitting right next to the auditory nerve, anything along those lines? But certainly we can use those studies as baselines, both invasive and non-invasive, using something along the lines of the electrically impulsed or the electric impulse, and as well as TPMS as well.
And likewise, this simulation here is at, I believe, 5 nanoseconds, 500.
500
500
nanoseconds.
and 500 nanoseconds. So if we could get it to run for, like, let's say 100 microseconds, we can see throw down with the simulation as well.
We also anticipate significantly more photons. Here we're running 1 million photons. We are expecting something along the lines of 7.8 times 10 to the 13 for a 100 microsecond stimulation. So quite 100-fold greater photons.
Yes.
Well, getting back to your models, when you did the cubic interpolation, why did you settle on cubic as opposed to quadratic or higher orders like p equals 4 or 5 or something as high as 10 or more?
Yeah, so my response to that would be, I didn't want to overfit the data using something along the lines of like a power order 5. Given that this is not easily predictable data from the wavelength ranges we have, the cubic interpolation I saw fit just to meet the complexity, but also not overfit that data as well.
How about goodness of fit or any other parameters you might have used?
Yeah, so the plan I have for that is to take a continuous function that we know, in this case would be water. And we can compare those two and say, how well does a cubic interpolation fit versus a quadratic or something along those lines? Because we know water for the entire range, and it's a very well-known subject. So that could be something we compare to as well. And additionally, we can use that for verification. If we use my method to predict the water at 1550, then how well does that stack up? Is it reliable? Is it off by a little bit? Do we need to change the algorithm as well?
All right. Thank you.
All right, I'll ask a few questions and then we can go right. So on page 4, when you talked about stakeholder, you forgot yourself. You are a stakeholder in this project, especially that you're learning a lot. So I don't know if you mentioned that. I don't remember if I see it. If I saw it, but you are like, don't forget yourself.
We are the researchers.
You not, your students.
Yeah.
No, but it's not that you forgot it's not there. My point is that don't forget, you're one of the important stakeholders in this project, right? You're adding value to your time being in Ohio State. So. Me being a robotic person and not being an optic person, I would ask, are there like veins or vessels around where you are trying to measure the photons? Could you send a device through drug delivery system up there, close there, and then like scatter those lasers or lights and then
Yeah.
observe that?
So-
Or is it a route that's been tested and been proved that it doesn't work?
That field would be called optogenetics, essentially a drug delivery that makes the neurons more susceptible to photobiomodulation. So essentially saying it makes them more willing to absorb photons. That's not something that we're exploring because it's, I believe that classifies itself as an invasive procedure,
Okay.
just because you have to take something either orally or a shot or something along those lines. So, but that is a researched area. Optogenetics would be what that is called.
Okay, good to know. So I think piggyback on what you said, how do you plan to validate your data extrapolation? So because you mentioned that you want to make sure that your data exploration is validated before you check the final project, right? What are your methods? What are you thinking? Because at this stage, you need to think about how am I testing things that I'm building,
Right.
right? So have you thought about it and what's the plan?
Yeah, so looking at those slides, sorry. One recommendation that Dr. Ronigan gave is using my approximation method. Can we predict what we already know? So could I predict the skull and see how well does that fit? So that would be kind of the first step that I do is apply my algorithm to the skull with the warning of not using the skull's data as well, because then it would be
Yeah.
a perfect fit.
Yeah.
So just how well can we approximate the data that we know and how well does that fit? And does that give us any sort of inclination of, does that require a change or is it good? Is it good enough?
Is data for human or for animal?
Human.
Human, okay. Because I remember you mentioned that you could test on animals as well, but then you have to think about, factor out like if the brain matter are the same, right?
Yes.
So the other thing that kind of along the same line is what are your deliverables? Let's say fast forward 4 months from now, what is it that you're gonna give us and say, yes, the project is done? What are gonna be itemized?
I would say having the sample molds done and having kind of we could demonstrate the actual testing method. We would need more laser goggles, but we could demonstrate it with more people. Currently, we only have 3 pairs of laser goggles priced out, but we could demonstrate our testing method and see if you think, or Dr. Krishna or Dr. Ronigan thinks that it is sufficient for what we're trying to accomplish.
What is sufficient?
I would say that it takes into account the biological tissues, and we are, by testing each individual sample mold, they say, okay, the way you're testing this makes sense using an integrating sphere or using multiple samples to acquire those optical coefficients and then doing a multi-sample test. So I would say the deliverables would be having the optical coefficients approximated, and then also having the multi-sample test done and also potentially demonstrating that.
So these two have to relate, right? So that is your deliverable.
Mhm.
That this is our estimation and this is our test bed. So a system that they can work on later. Plus that what we get is proving that our method is correct, right?
Right.
What if these two don't match? What's your plan B? What's gonna happen if you did the test, you have done all work separately, and then you match and say, oops. Like what is, again, it's fine, but what is your plan? What are you gonna do at that moment that, oh, these two don't match? Where do you go from there?
So just to clarify, you mean if the approximated optical coefficients aren't replicated using the sample models?
I think that's what you mean when you go to your critical path, right? I think that's where you talked about it. Verification, simulation verification of testing, that's what you mean, right?
Not for the coefficients.
So
Well,
what does
that's
that
not
mean?
using the simulation. So the simulation would be using the optical power input and output to say, we're providing this many photons based on the power and the pulse width and the exposure time to the brain. And then at certain areas, we can measure, if I go back to the MCX.
Yeah.
So we could say like, let's say we place our photodetector, at this coordinate, what's the optical output that we expect? And then we can look at our photodetector data and say, this is what we're experimentally getting.
Okay, does that expectation relate to this coefficient?
It's the actual scattering and absorption is based on the coefficients. Yes.
Yeah. So like, I'm ignorant in this field, so to me, it's a little bit hard to relate the two part that you're doing.
Right.
So that it should be clear enough, at least for me, as part of your sponsor,
Mhm.
that how are you bringing these back together at the end?
So generally you have these coefficients here. You plug them into this and you get this distribution. And then we try to recreate those coefficients, the optical
So
phantom.
you put the photon receiver in every single point and see what is the pattern?
Yeah, you could either do, this is something I've discussed with Dr. Runningen, is that you could either take the photodetector, which I believe has a capture radius of about 1 millimeter. So you could move that around and get kind of create like a map of your energy dispersion.
Mhm.
And then you could create, the same type of graph using that energy dispersion. Or if you wanted to collect just a kind of general area, you could take some sort of focusing aperture and focus that light using a lens onto the photodetector, capturing the entire area, maybe not being as detailed, but certainly saying over this entire area, we're receiving this general light output.
Okay, so this is something that you need to confirm with your research group. And to me, it's just like a very clear statement of what is it they're gonna happen at the end, and we go by that. I really like the term mapping, right? So it could be approximate mapping of, like, I don't know, a 1 centimeter radius next to whatever photon, like the photodetector that you put.
Right.
But it's a mapping of that area. You're comparing this with the estimation. The estimation says it should be 95%. We show 95% alignment with our estimation. That makes sense to me, because then this is a project that will be ongoing. The next team is gonna take on.
Yeah.
If they don't have this number and clear objectives, so it's like very relative, right?
Yeah.
So you wanna make sure it's fixed. And I'm assuming you would eventually write papers, right? Data, and this will be what community will ask. So be very clear about it from beginning. And easily you can confirm with your mentors and sponsors of those values. Yeah,
And-
yeah, go ahead.
Just one thing I really like about the way you're presenting it there is that, in terms of putting a proposal together, it can be pretty dangerous to say the only acceptable result is a match. Like, you're at a really early stage of this, that's probably not the only acceptable result. I mean, the acceptable result may be that we have implemented our simulation well enough to be able to formulate these maps and make this connection to neurons. And we have implemented our experiment well enough to be able to make these maps. Like, and then we're gonna compare them. Like, that's the point of the project, not to match them, but to be able to produce them from both techniques and to compare them.
And then that makes your life easy because everything is very clear, right? When are you ordering your laser setups? Since it's out of my hand.
I was going to say if it got approved today, so I guess we can wait for Dr. Krishna, but if it got approved
Okay.
completely, then we can, I can put the
So that
purchase and request.
the
it.
question, my question comes from, you put 113, starting the setup, which is 4 days after school starts.
Mhm.
University is closed 23rd to, I don't know, sometime in
New Year's,
January,
I think.
New Year's. So everybody needs to take a break. So take that into consideration. If you need to adjust your date, adjust it, give realistic dates, not things that, oh, we have a lot of things to do, we need to put it in here. Let's move the dates. If you have to lighten your scope of your work, like now is a good time to think, and okay, out of these 5, we can do 4 for sure. 1 is gonna be like feature. If it happened,
Right.
great. If it not, it's fine. So again, get confirmation, because to me, the approval of this stage is based on Dr. Laura and Dr. Krishna, because I'm not well versed in this, but I know from ordering and all those shipment and stuff, everybody's on vacation. This looks like a very tight deadline
Okay.
to start something, right? So revise this. For the mold, yes, you can work it. We have almost everything. You can just buy the dye. One very minor comment. For your report, change either the color of those, all the greens, because colorblind people cannot see those. You can also change it by like adding a star or a dash or a plus. You could keep the light colors if you like, but then add a sign so it can differentiate. Because this will be reported, they will send proposals. Someone might be colorblind, so you want to make sure you can see them. I'm not talking about this one, I'm talking about the
Oh, for the,
coefficient.
okay,
Yeah, this might be something standard. You still can use grayscale, but definitely for this, because you have circles and same dash for all of them.
right,
Yeah.
And if I was colorblind, I could not see the most three important.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
So, just a, small thing, but overall, great presentation. I really like your teamwork. I think you also surprised me. It was voluntold, I put them together, so they had no choice. But they did mention interest in this project. But I think, after the little bit of rearranging the team, now everything is very cohesive and everybody also learned how to stay on track and how to keep each other committed, right? Life happens. You just have to have plan for it. Plan B, C, D, E, all the way to Z. Right. I don't have any further comments.
A couple.
Yeah.
So I have some chemistry background and so I'm gonna ask a couple experimentalist chemist questions. One is just a comment that in addition to what Dr. LaRocco mentioned about possibly damaging the brain, there's a possibility you're gonna damage your phantom. And so you should run a calculation of how much power you're gonna be absorbing in your phantom, given the amount of dye you're adding, and just look through, like, are we gonna be melting our phantom as soon as we expose it to our lasers? So just double check that. One aspect that was kind of implicit in several of your slides, but I would like you to talk about explicitly. What are the safety concerns this experiment raises, and what are you doing to address those?
Well, I guess I could start, like, one of the safety concerns, we're working with very high powered lasers. So, you know, we can't just have regular lab goggles, you know, things like that. And just all in all, just lasers is one of the safety things I just wanted to add. If Dr. Camp has anything else to add.
yeah, so in terms of safety concerns, obviously you, in the infrared region, we're dealing with, I believe it's called the retinal damage area, where light is not focused on the surface of the eye, but it's focused on the actual insides of the eye. And I think the worst part is you can't see this light, so you don't have a
Yeah.
natural instinct to look away. So you're actually just standing there being hurt, but you don't even know. So that is certainly a safety concern, and to address that, we're using laser goggles, as you know. And additionally, we're also, I took the laser safety training, but I also requested that they take it over break or the week that we get back with whenever they want to, just before we're testing, obviously. So I thought it was important for them to take. I learned a lot, so I think they would also learn a lot. So we have laser safety curtains in Dries Lab. We have goggles, we have, I'm going to be looking into laser dumps and things along those lines as well, just to terminate any scattered light that we might encounter.
Which hot plate you're planning to use for melting the wax?
The one that was in the capstone lab,
Yeah.
How hot the wax needs to get to melt?
56 degrees Celsius.
Okay, so you just get second degree burn if you touch, like if it spills on you.
I have an
Yes.
apartment, so I have cooking mitts.
Okay. Alright. You also need to make sure there aren't a student around when you're testing.
Okay.
I think actually it's a really good idea. Add like a safety section in your project management and list this. Like, it's good when we talk about it, but when you have it listed, you make sure that you go step by step. I think this is a really good.
From looking at this, I mean, the laser would be my primary safety concern too, but the heat is one of them. The chemicals are another.
Yeah.
You know, you're working with chemicals, there are chemical safety procedures that you may need to follow. So there are things called safety data sheets that you should be able to reference for all of your chemicals that will give you information about what safety steps you might need to take with those. The titanium dioxide, you know, sometimes if it's in a powder form, that can be a particular concern and you need to do some controls. So that would be something to look into. But the steps you're describing sound like what I would expect. I mean, keeping it isolated so that you're protecting the people around you and then protecting yourselves. Yeah.
All right, a couple of comments real quick. One is on the simulation, the MCX page where you had the 1064 and the 1550. This is just a small note. The others have kind of touched on it before, but I've seen this software many, many times and we've gone over it many times. But one thing I realized is units.
Yeah.
So that's something that's going to be important for any report, any proposal, anything going forward, because I've seen this software a lot of times. I kind of take it for granted and I've overlooked it in our previous meetings, so that's on me for not reminding you. But the second one would be getting back to some of the different photobiomodulation applications. What you're clearly showing here is that one might be better for whole brain stimulation potentially, the other one a little bit more precise.
Mhm.
So maybe this might be beyond the scope of the expertise or the project, but if you have specific applications where you think the 1550 nanometer would be really good for neurostimulation, like examples would be look up things like TMS or TDCS or other neuromodulation modalities and say, hey, this might be very good for similar things that involve not too precise, but more regional areas of the brain. To speak directly from experience, something that also might be it will be directly related to is LIFO, low intensity focused ultrasound, the other study I'm working on right now. This kind of hits a very similar region and basically does similar amounts of power in the brain, hopefully without as much of mechanical antics, shall we say. But that is one potential application. Whereas 1064 may be more if you need to do full area of the brain for energetics under different circumstances. Now, literature on photobiomodulation, you could do a dissertation on something like that, but maybe just a small niche topic, like, oh, maybe this would work for dementia patients. Maybe this would work for stroke rehab, something like that.